Okay. All right. So thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Estella Lugo. We have another special CMT Connect webinar for you all tonight. And like we usually say, CMT Connect webinars are meant to empower, connect, and educate the CMT community. So I know this one was had a lot of interest in it, and it's all about SORD deficiency. So we're going to learn tonight about what exactly is this new form of CMT. What are the symptoms? What is this new exciting investigational work and research and study and clinical trial that's on the forefront? And how can everybody be screened and know if they're viable for the study? So without further ado, we have Shoshana Shendelman tonight joining us. She is the CEO and founder of Applied Therapeutics. We also will be having a CMT patient tonight, Priya, sharing her story with us. And so yeah, let's welcome Shoshana. She is a PhD from Columbia, and tell us a little bit about how you started Applied Therapeutics and what your goal is.
Sure, absolutely. So yes, I have a PhD in cellular and molecular biophysics, whatever that is, but I did most of my research in neurobiology and neurodegenerative diseases. So that's very relevant. And I spent a little over a decade in strategy consulting and working on drugs where there are a lot of drugs available already for those diseases. And I actually had a family member who developed a rare disease and there were no treatments available. And for the first time, I went from being on the research side to being on the family side, and really, understanding that process of having a rare disease and being told that there's literally no treatments available, which I'm sure is a place that a lot of attendees on the webinar have been. And it's really, for me, it was a life-changing moment. And I sort of realized I didn't want to be developing the 35th drug for something that we're already treatments for. And that's what really pushed me to found Applied Therapeutics. So that's probably a good segue into a little bit of the background of the company, if that's okay. It might help to sort of hear what we do, knowing the background of why I started Applied might make a little bit more sense. So if it's okay,
Sure.
I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see them. So this slide is what Applied Therapeutics is about. So applying science to transform lives is not just something we say, and hopefully having that little segue of my background and my personal experience, puts that into context. And all of us at Applied Therapeutics are really here to develop treatments and therapies that we feel can really be life-changing and impact people's lives, especially patients who have no treatment options available and are really in desperate need of therapy. And so, that really comes across our whole development plan. Overall, we're targeting pathways, enzymes, receptors where we very well understand their role in the disease. We're using as quick pathways as possible through development. We just jump right in and get moving, which, I know from personal experience, the time it takes to develop a drug makes a lot of difference if you're on the other side of it, waiting for the first treatment to be available. And it really does, I think, make a big difference. And we feel that every day in our work lives at Applied and our personal lives, that hopefully what we're doing really makes a difference to people. So today we're going to be talking about SORD deficiency. And SORD deficiency is a progressive hereditary neuropathy that affects peripheral nerves and motor neurons. And it results in significant disability, loss of sensory function, and decreased mobility. It is a rare disease. It impacts a little bit over 3,000 patients in the US and about 4,000 in Europe. So overall, it's responsible for 7 to 9% of cases that exist right now of CMT2 or distal hereditary motor neuropathy. So patients who have SORD deficiency most likely previously received a symptomatic diagnosis of CMT2 or dHMN of unknown genetic cause. And recently, thanks to some really groundbreaking research, mutations in the SORD gene were shown to be responsible for disease symptoms in this subset of CMT2 and dHMN patients. And that's why research into the genetic cause of disease in patients who don't know their genetic cause or don't understand, sort of why they have these symptoms is so important. Because in many cases, once we understand what the genetic mutation is or genetic cause, which protein or enzyme is deficient in these patients, we have a very good idea of how to target that disease with potential treatments. And that was the case for SORD deficiency. So as soon as researchers knew what the gene mutation was, we immediately understood why that resulted in the symptoms that it does. And there was a clear path to development of a potential drug for SORD deficiency. So it's a good example, I think, of why research is important and where we can go from there. So in order to understand what SORD deficiency is, I think it's helpful to take a quick look at the biochemistry behind SORD deficiency. Don't worry, we won't make this too complicated. But basically, patients with SORD deficiency are missing the enzyme that's responsible for metabolism of sorbitol. And that enzyme is called sorbitol dehydrogenase. The acronym is SORD. And sorbitol is part of a normal metabolic process in our bodies. So most glucose or sugar is actually not metabolized into sorbitol. It goes through a different pathway. But a very small percent, about 1% of our body's glucose is metabolized by an alternative pathway called the polyol pathway, where glucose gets converted to sorbitol by an enzyme called aldose reductase, and you'll see in a minute why that's important. And then sorbitol is further metabolized to fructose and converted to energy by the enzyme sorbitol dehydrogenase. So patients who have SORD deficiency are missing the enzyme sorbitol dehydrogenase, and as a result, they can't metabolize sorbitol. So sorbitol is produced by aldose reductase, and it has nowhere to go. So it builds up to very high levels in blood and tissues. And patients with SORD deficiency have about 100 times the level of sorbitol in their blood versus unaffected individuals. And one of the reasons that this research was so amazing was that we know why sorbitol is toxic. So there's actually been decades of research already into sorbitol toxicity, especially in neurons. So as soon as we understood that the problem here is that sorbitol is building up at very high levels, it made absolute sense as to why this results in the symptoms that it does. So what are the symptoms of SORD deficiency? 100% of patients with SORD deficiency have lower limb weakness and motor dysfunction. So this most often presents as difficulty walking, running, climbing stairs. Most patients have difficulties with balance and also ataxia or gait issues. Now, not all, about 60% of patients with SORD deficiency also have upper limb weakness and coordination problems in their hands and arms. Many patients have tremor. Most patients have neuropathic pain or sensory dysfunction. So how do you know if you have SORD deficiency? Sometimes when a new cause of disease is revealed, the question is, do I have it? How do I know if I have it? So most likely you may have SORD deficiency if you have a previous symptomatic diagnosis of dHMN or CMT2 unknown, where there's an undefined genetic cause. And since SORD deficiency is an autosomal recessive disease, it means that you most likely do not have an affected parent if you have SORD deficiency. So if you have a parent, either your biological mother or father, who also has symptoms of a motor neuron disease, then it's probably a dominant form of disease, so that would not be SORD deficiency. And now you can actually find out if you have SORD deficiency pretty easily. It's a simple blood test to measure sorbitol levels, or a genetic test that can look at the gene for SORD. So why is it important to find out if you have SORD deficiency? In rare diseases, it's really important for the medical community to better understand a disease, especially when it's a new rare disease, and the specific symptoms and issues that are meaningful to those patients. And this helps us to improve diagnosis, and it also helps us to design better clinical trials. Also, an investigational drug is being studied in clinical trials in patients with SORD deficiency. So that is important, and it's important to find out if you may qualify for a clinical trial. Applied Therapeutics is actually running a free SORD deficiency screening program to help diagnose and find out if patients may qualify for a clinical trial. A blood test can be performed in your neurologist's office or via a home health nursing visit. We're running this testing program for patients age 16 to 65. The mean age of onset of SORD deficiency is usually about 17. So it's important to be able to test patients in the teenage years as well. And if you're interested in being tested for SORD deficiency and finding out if you may qualify for a clinical trial, please email us at sword@appliedtherapeutics.com. So now switching gears a little bit, we'll talk about the AT007 investigational program. I just want to clarify up front, when we talk about what is AT007, it's an investigational drug. That means it's permitted by the FDA for use in clinical trials, but it's not yet approved for treatment of SORD deficiency. AT007 is an aldose reductase inhibitor. It blocks the enzyme that converts glucose to sorbitol that comes just before the sorbitol dehydrogenase enzyme. AT007 has been previously studied in adult healthy volunteers, about 100 adult healthy volunteers, and in adult patients with a different rare disease that involves sugar metabolism called galactosemia, and also in pediatric galactosemia patients aged 2 to 17. In clinical trials, AT007 is dosed once daily in a strawberry flavored oral suspension or liquid. So this shows us visually how AT007 works. So if you recall from the last biochemical slide, the enzyme aldose reductase converts glucose to sorbitol, and patients who have SORD deficiency are actually missing that enzyme, and sorbitol builds up to very high levels. So if we block aldose reductase and we stop conversion of glucose to sorbitol, then that's one way to just decrease sorbitol from even being produced, so that the fact that SORD deficiency patients are missing the enzyme to further metabolize sorbitol doesn't matter, because hopefully we're blocking sorbitol production before it even starts. So we have a lot of data that I'll walk through just very quickly, not to bore people too much, and then we'll stop. I just have a few more slides, and we can open it up for questions. I see a bunch of them are coming through in the chat, so don't worry, I will stop and answer those. So before going into clinical trials, there's a lot of preclinical work that happens, things like cell culture, animal models. So here's what we know about AT007 so far. In fibroblasts, or cells that are cultured in the lab from patients with sorbitol, dehydrogenase deficiency, AT007 blocks sorbitol production. So what we're looking at here on the graph is that if you culture cells from healthy volunteers or patients who do not have SORD deficiency, there's very low levels of sorbitol in the cells when they're cultured in the lab. When you culture cells that come from a SORD deficiency patient, and that's what this gray bar is, you can see that the cells, even in the lab, have very high levels of sorbitol. And when we treat those cells from the SORD deficiency patients with AT007, we're able to really significantly reduce sorbitol levels. There's also a Drosophila or fruit fly model of SORD deficiency. So researchers at the University of Miami actually knocked out the SORD gene from Drosophila or fruit flies. And those fruit flies develop symptoms of the disease that are pretty similar to humans. So they have a climbing problem. They have mobility and motility issues. And they also have neuronal degeneration, which is actually pretty easy to see in fruit flies. So the way that we look at it is by looking at what's called vacuolar structures. So don't worry, I'll walk through this. They're beautiful pictures, but it's actually easy for a non-scientist to see what's happening here. So on the left-hand panel is normal or wild type fruit flies. And you can actually see, if you look at a segment of their neurons, that they're highly ordered, and you see a nice broad fluorescent pattern across the screen here. But in the fruit flies that are missing the SORD enzyme or that have SORD deficiency, you see some neuronal degeneration, and it looks like these black holes in the fluorescent structure. And those are called vacuolar structures. And if you treat those same SORD deficient fruit flies with AT007, you can see that the neurons don't have those vacuolar structures or black holes anymore. You fixed the problem here. And you can actually count those vacuolar structures. This was some scientist's job in the lab looking through the microscope. And so what we're seeing on the right-hand panel here is the number of vacuolar structures in a normal fruit fly. That's the left-hand column, so not so many. And in the SORD deficient flies, which are treated with the placebo, which is called DMSO, you see that they have a high number of vacuolar structures or neuronal degeneration. And when you treat those same fruit flies with AT007, you bring their neurons back down to normal and you stop that degeneration. So all of this data led us to run the first clinical trial in SORD deficiency. So this is what we call a pilot clinical trial, just a small study in 8 patients with SORD deficiency. And they were treated open label, so everybody was on the active drug. There was no placebo arm here over a period of 30 days. And what you can see on the left-hand panel here is that when they all came into the clinical trial before they were treated with the drug, that's what these gray bars are for each individual patient. And the sorbitol level is what you're seeing here on the y-axis. So they all have very high levels of sorbitol, about 100 times normal, and that's what we expect in SORD deficiency patients. And then we treated them with AT007 once daily, and the green bars are their sorbitol levels after drug treatment. So the sorbitol levels really significantly go down. You can see that on each individual patient, every single one of them out of the 8. So the mean reduction or the average reduction was 66% from baseline, with a range or the lowest reduction being 54% and the highest reduction being 75%. So we were really excited about this data. We thought it was pretty fantastic. And this is the basis for an upcoming registrational study in patients with SORD deficiency. So a registrational trial is the trial for eventual approval of the drug if the results are positive. We will be giving full details on this clinical trial very soon, but in the meantime, we can sort of, with broad strokes, let you know what this study will be about. It will be in a larger number of patients, so about 50 patients with SORD deficiency. It will be placebo controlled because that's what's required to get a drug approved. And it will look at sorbitol reduction, that's what we call a biomarker outcome, followed by long-term outcomes of how patients feel and function. It will be multiple centers in the US and EU, and we will be starting that trial before the end of this year. So we're very excited and more to come there. So what should you do if you think you might have SORD deficiency? Please consider getting tested and think about sharing your experience with others in the community and with your physician. It's important that everyone understands, more about the symptoms of SORD deficiency, but more importantly, what's important to patients, how they feel every day. And we know that in clinical trials, it's really important to have patient-reported outcomes and to make sure that we study what's really important to patients who have the disease. And with all rare diseases, it's important for the patient community to unite. So please consider connecting with other patients with SORD deficiency. I think the HNF has some information on that at the end of this webinar. And if you qualify, please consider participating in a clinical trial. It's the only way that we can really get drugs approved, especially in rare diseases. And so with that, I really thank you for watching the presentation. I saw there were a lot of questions coming in through the chat. Estella, is it okay if we run through a couple of those?
Sure. I had one here from Mary. She said she's not eligible for the trial because she's over 65. Can she still be tested for SORD?
Yes. So we are working through that. We'll get some more information on how to test for SORD. If you are over 65, because it is age 16 to 65 right now, there is a genetic test for SORD deficiency that your doctor can order. But we're also working on trying to somehow permit patients who are over 65 to get tested through our program. But in the meantime, if you don't want to wait, you can just ask your doctor to draw a blood sample and request that genetic test.
Okay, excellent. We had another question here from Christy. She says her husband and 4 children have HNPP. Could this be from SORD? So based on what you mentioned, it seems like it wouldn't be.
Yeah, so unfortunately, if a parent and children have the symptoms, it's most likely a dominant type of CMT or HMN. And SORD deficiency is recessive. So unfortunately, it's unlikely that that's SORD deficiency.
Okay. Veronica would like to know, does the test have to be given by a neurologist, or can your PCP give the blood test?
Oh, great question. So if your PCP knows how to fill out the forms for genetic testing, then they can perform the test. It's really, it's not hard, and we can send out additional information there. If you would like your PCP to draw a blood sample for the SORD testing that we're running at Applied Therapeutics, that's also possible. And same thing, either you or your doctor could email us at sword@appliedtherapeutics.com. We can take blood samples from either physicians, or we can send one of our home health nurses to your house to draw a blood sample for testing for SORD deficiency. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible to get tested, and it can definitely be performed by your PCP.
Great. And that, again, that email has been pasted in the chat box. Again, sword@appliedtherapeutics.com. I know we have Priya with us as well. One more question regarding the blood test. Is it covered by insurance?
The genetic testing should be covered by insurance. If you have a symptomatic diagnosis, then, and that's why it might actually be a little bit easier for your neurologist to know how, or your neuromuscular specialist to know how to get those forms through, but really it should be covered. And the testing that we're running through Applied Therapeutics is free. So if you want to be tested through our program, either in your physician's office or through one of our home health nurses, that is a 100% free procedure that does not need to go through your insurance at all.
Great. And we also have confirmed SORD patient with us, Priya Gonzalez. So thank you for joining us tonight, Priya.
Hi, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So we're
I'm sorry I'm sitting in, but I'm having one of those rough days.
No worries. We can relate to that. So we appreciate you joining us, and we really wanted to share a little bit about your story, because I'm sure there's some people watching that are wondering, could I have SORD? What was your journey growing up with? Like, when did you first start experiencing symptoms? What were they? And when were you finally diagnosed with SORD officially?
I started my journey many years ago. I started with my sugar going down when I was about 10ish. My mother bring me to the doctor all the time. They did all kind of tests. And I saw a neurologist when I was like 11. I always fell. I broke several toes by the time I was 12. And since then, until I was about 35, I saw at least 11 neurologists. And I'm 42 now. I actually got diagnosed last year with SORD.
Wow.
But symptomatically, like for as long as I could remember, even as a kid, my family's like big hikers. And I was always the one in the back and always, oh, you're so lazy. Come on, walk. And my feet hurt and I was tired. And I was like 9. So it was a very long journey.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. I'm sure. Unfortunately, that's the case for many undiagnosed CMT patients. So that's why we're so excited about this, because at least finally we're getting some answers and some potential treatments. So, that's the upside of this. Did your symptoms progress at any point? And when was that point at all, or was there a
My
noticeable?
symptoms actually did progress. I think like the age of like 28, 29, I had a traumatic experience in my life, and I started with my tremor, like terribly. And I had seen a neurologist about my tremor, and they did an MRI on my brain. And he actually did an EMG on me, but he only did one arm. And he told me that this is a true story, that my parents probably did heavy drugs in the 70s, and that's why I have a tremor.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
I promise you, that's what he said to me. And then when I was about 34, 35, no, like 34, I actually got a flu shot, and I was in bed for about 8 days. And I finally got out of bed after 8 days, and I finally went back to work. And on my way to work, I lost the vision a little bit on my right eye, because I also have lesions on my brain. And I sideswiped the car, and I went to the University of Miami. So funny. And they told me that I had MS. I saw the neurologist for MS in the University of Miami. And then I went to New York, and I met a Dr. Michael Shapiro, and he diagnosed me with CMT.
Okay. So a lot of visits, a lot of misinformation. I'm glad you found your way towards confirmed diagnosis. I know you mentioned your sugar levels, which I think a few people here are making some comments. Eric asked, does a history of high triglycerides indicate a potential SORD deficiency? Maybe Shoshana, you could speak a little bit about that, and then maybe Priya, I know you've had some issues with your sugar levels as well, which could be a very telltale sign of SORD deficiency.
Well, yes, and maybe not though. So I think that it's important that, and this is why we actually need patients to get diagnosed to find out if they have SORD or if they do not. And then, either please participate in a clinical trial, or at least make sure that your physician knows that you've been diagnosed with SORD and that you're really verbal about your symptoms and what you feel, and what you feel may be a result of SORD deficiency. So right now there have really been a very small number of patients studied. So a total of about 40 with SORD deficiency, and we know that there are about 3,000 in the US. And so when you have such a small number of patients, there are a few who have had hypoglycemia, not all. We haven't had any patients yet with high triglycerides. It doesn't mean that that's not a symptom. We know that 100% of patients with SORD deficiency have the lower limb symptoms, right? So that's, and that's the case for most CMT2 patients, right? But only 60% have upper limb symptoms, and about half have tremor. So when you look at these really small numbers, there are some things that come out right off the bat, the things that are really high prevalence in the community, but there might be other symptoms that are lower prevalence, lower percentage, that it's hard to tell with such small numbers. Like, is that SORD, or is it another contributing factor of sort of family genetics or some other condition? So we have had a couple of patients who have had issues with hypo or hyperglycemia. Kind of makes sense because we know that this is a disease of sugar metabolism. We want to make sure that that's not confused with diabetes, right? So that's usually a question that follows, like, could my diabetes be caused by SORD? No. This is a very specific, neurological disorder. To answer the question in the chat, we've not seen high triglycerides. It doesn't mean that it's not, necessarily a symptom of SORD deficiency. So in seeing greater numbers of patients, in running a clinical trial that's 50 patients instead of 8, that will really help us to clarify, what is really a symptom of SORD deficiency, versus unrelated, and what are the percentages of those other symptoms, and how do they impact patients? Like, how do you see that come through? Which I think is really important when we talk to patients like Priya and sort of hear about, it's easier for us as scientists and physicians to talk about the clinical signs and symptoms, but what does that mean to patients? Yeah, walking or running more slowly, than your peers when you're a kid, tripping and falling a lot because of balance issues, lots of broken bones when you're a kid running around, in your feet and toes. Hearing about sort of how that has presented throughout Priya's life, I think is also really important. And as we hear from more and more SORD deficiency patients, how it's actually impacted them and shown through in everyday life activities, I think that'll be really helpful as well in educating the community. Patients might sort of say, I also had that, as a child, maybe this is something I should get tested for.
Yeah. And just to clarify, Sarah wanted to know, is it just one gene related to SORD deficiency, or are there more? And which gene is it?
Yeah, it's the SORD gene. It's actually what it's called.
Okay.
Yeah, it's for sorbitol dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme. So it's the SORD gene, and it is a single gene, and it's autosomal recessive. So you do have to have 2 copies of the mutated gene, one from each set of parents, in order to develop the phenotype.
Gotcha. Okay. And Renee was asking here, she had an inconclusive or negative test for CMT1 and 2, no history in her family. She has the symptoms both upper and lower swallowing. She also has lesions and markers on her brain, and the neurologist feels it was a stroke as a younger person. So, I mean, that seems like it would should be a great candidate for a test at least, right? And just to clarify, the test will reveal a definite yes or no, because the sorbitol levels are so such a,
Sorbitol levels are 100 times higher than normal. I mean, there's no question. We also send them for genetic testing for the clinical trial just to confirm via a secondary vehicle, but everyone that has had high sorbitol levels has been confirmed positive by genetic testing. So the sorbitol levels, it's such a clear difference that it's a pretty accurate way to tell.
yeah. And going back to Priya, I mean, how did it feel to finally have like a final diagnosis and answers to some of the symptoms that you've lived with, I mean, most of your life?
It felt good. It felt good to know it, because for a while it was just like, oh, I have CMT too. And then you see another doctor and the doctor's like, you don't present with the normal symptoms of CMT. I should say one of my symptoms is, this is what confused most neurologists and most doctors that I seen. My reflexes are hyper. So most people with CMT have no
Yeah.
reflex,
Right.
and mine are not normal. They're extremely fast. So each neurologist I've seen in different states that I've lived in, or in an emergency room that the neurologist comes, they always look at me like I have the definitive leg, right? The champagne inverted leg. But some of my symptoms doesn't match to CMT 1 or 2. I
Right.
also got a CMT 2 genetic test, and it did come back inconclusive when I was like 36. It felt super good to know exactly what was going on, because they kept asking me, does your mom have it? Does your dad have it? Anybody in your family? It was always, I was, what is that called? The mutation, like I was the first mutation,
Right. Spontaneous.
a spontaneous mutation. That was always what my answers was, because
Right.
nobody in my family has symptoms.
Yeah.
Um,
So Elizabeth asks that can you have an onset at a later age? Are you aware of any onset cases, such as people in their 60s? Is that unheard of or still too early to know?
So I think it's still too early to know. Again, when we're talking about 40 patients who have been studied to date with SORD deficiency, we do know that in that small number of patients, the mean age was 17 and the range was plus or minus 8 years. So that means the lowest, range was age 9. So that's about what Priya experienced, right? And the oldest age was 25, 26. So, so far, and that's kind of reflected in the 8 patients that we had in our pilot study. They all had an age of onset of sort of, mid to late high school, early college years, somewhere in that 17 to 25 range. Although it's interesting because a lot of them do kind of look back and say, well, I really only went to a neurologist when I was 17, but I was really running slowly, not keeping up in sports, tripping a lot, for many years earlier. So where I'm going with this is we have not yet had any patients studied with a very late age of onset in their 60s, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So, this is just another plug for getting tested for SORD deficiency, because just with such a small number of patients, being studied to date, it might be the case that, we all know from the research that's been done so far that this is what a quote typical SORD patient looks like right now. So maybe, just like happened to Priya, the neurologists were sort of, oh, I've seen this recently, you kind of fit this description, let's get you tested for SORD deficiency. But that doesn't mean, other people might fit a slightly different description and they just might not be, tested for it because we don't know about it yet. So to date, we've not had any patients with an age of onset over the age of 30. But it, again, does not mean that it doesn't exist. And that's important for us to find out.
And does it make more sense to get tested for the sorbitol levels before you take a genetic test? Is that
that's how we're doing it in our clinical trial. We're looking at sorbitol levels and then the genetic test, but both, make a lot of sense. And, through our testing service, for the clinical trial, we can look at both. Or if you just prefer to go through your physician, they can just order a genetic test. The sorbitol test is not yet commercially available. It is something that we're working on in the background so that it could be an easier, or faster way of diagnosis. But right now, we can do sorbitol testing through our program, as well as genetic testing. If your doctor wants to not go through Applied Therapeutics, they can order the genetic test. It's offered through GeneDx, which is, pretty common for genetic testing. So I think that it is important that patients are verbal about it. Either if you think you might have SORD, please think about contacting us. We'll send someone out to get you tested, or, tell your physician, I think I might have this, I want to have a test done.
right? So if you've had genetic testing before, then there's no way that you've been tested for SORD yet on those genetic tests because it hasn't been made available yet.
Correct. So it may involve, another blood test and sending it for genetic testing. Now, some of the companies that perform genetic testing keep your samples on file. You can opt to do that. And when new genetic tests become available, they'll, test your sample. They don't do it right away. They have some kind of schedule where it's like every few years, but we definitely have, had patients come into our clinical trial and be referred to us who just, phone call came to their doctor one day, hey, we just ran your patient's blood sample through the new genetic screen and they've tested positive for SORD. So, that does happen. Patients may actually receive a phone call like that, but it doesn't necessarily happen on a schedule or within a period of time. So you may have to proactively ask for it.
That's the key, being proactive.
Yeah.
Mine took about a year.
A year.
I got tested
during COVID as well, right? Yeah.
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 It was right before COVID hit. As soon as I got tested, I became part of the research and with Dr. Supporta in Miami. As soon as I got the test, he called me about a year later, but COVID hit like maybe a month afterwards.
Right.
So
Shoshana, we have a few people asking about COVID vaccine and SORD, whether it's safe. Is there a way to answer that at this point, or?
I may need to stay away from COVID vaccine questions because it's so controversial. But I think that I believe all the patients in our clinical trial had been vaccinated for COVID. It might be one of the reasons they felt comfortable, traveling to the clinical site. There's no reason for us to think that there's any kind of interaction. So I think it just remains in the category of that's your personal decision.
Agreed.
So, Shoshana, can I ask, am I part of that? The research you're doing? Is my name on there?
You may be part of it, Priya. You're definitely part of
Supporta. I saw Dr. Supporta in the summer just now. And I saw him twice. I was visiting my family in Miami, and I saw him twice before I live in Michigan now.
Yeah.
Before I came back, and he had asked me, would you come back to Miami? And I was like, yeah, of course, because I think he told me I was like his only patient with SORD.
Wow.
So he had asked me if I would go back, and I said, yeah, that I would go.
Wow. So one of our clinical sites, and we'll do the full unveiling of all of the clinical sites in the trial soon, but you can have a sneak preview that one of them will be Miami. They've actually been very, just more of a general comment. I think that I've been super impressed by the way that the entire research community and patient community and advocacy organizations have come together with SORD deficiency so quickly. Also considering that it sort of came about, during the pandemic, right? So the first research publication on this topic, the first identification of, here's the gene that's causing these symptoms and here's the problem in SORD deficiency, came out in just May of 2020. So first of all, that was, only about a year and a half ago. Second of all, middle of the pandemic, right? But everyone immediately came to the table. So as soon as that research was clear that sorbitol is the problem, the enzyme that precedes SORD is aldose reductase, we had an influx of, of interest from the research community, from physicians involved, and everyone has just come to the table pretty immediately to say, yep, let's get this done. Let's run clinical trials. Let's figure out more about the disease itself. Physicians from the Inherited Neuropathy Consortium, basically everyone that was involved in identifying the cause of SORD deficiency has, really come forward and been collaborative, helped us design our clinical trials, helped us identify patients. The advocacy groups, the HNF, CMTA, everyone was right there. What can we do? How can we work on this together? How can we collaborate? And patients just, coming in immediately, either if they had a diagnosis or they wanted to get tested. So I'm very, very thankful to all aspects of the community. Everyone, it's a perfect example of how all elements of a community need to come together for treatment. And I just can't say enough positive things about the CMT and dHMN communities. So thank you to everyone who was a part of that. Even if it was just talking to your physician, thank you to the HNF for, everything that you guys have done to raise awareness, and for patients like Priya who have been able to come forward and, talk about having SORD deficiency and help to educate us on, what's important to patients. So that's my, sharing the love speech, but we're really so thankful. It's so easy for these things not to happen, so seamlessly, and especially during the pandemic. There's a lot of reasons why that, could not have come together as well as it did. So we're sincerely thankful.
Yeah, the feeling's mutual. We're super excited to see this moving along so quickly, and for the testing to be so accessible, which I think a lot of times it's such a barrier, but to have such an accessible test like the sorbitol levels, and of course you making that possible, I think is a huge relief for a lot of people where obviously genetic tests and all of that is a little bit harder to attain the questions from. And
I'm always going to share my story because I went through years and years and years of seeing doctors, and oh, she's clumsy, and oh, she's this, and oh, I even had a doctor tell me that I need to see a psychiatrist, that everything, all my symptoms were in my head.
Wow.
And I was like, this, and I don't know about everybody else, but I definitely have like episodes where I'm like, I'm okay, I'm doing pretty good. And then all of a sudden, like a crash like today. And I would say this to the doctor, like, I almost feel like I have like an episode that I'm just like bad and I can't move and I can't lift my arms and my eyes burn me like terribly. And they would just look at me like, there's nothing wrong with you though. We did this and we did that and we did this. And, it's a horrible feeling to know there's something wrong with you because you can't even walk that fast. Your feet's not picking up. Every time you go to walk upstairs, you trip and fall. And somebody to tell you there's nothing wrong with you. You're fine. It's, I'd rather let the world know everything that I go through, embarrassing or not, but that somebody else doesn't go. I mean, I might have been going through that for like 25 years of seeing doctor after doctor after doctor. It's annoying, It becomes frustrating for anybody.
Of course, it has such a huge impact on your life and many lives. So we want to do our best to, this is why we do what we do. That's why HNF exists. That's why Applied Therapeutics exists. And we're super grateful to have this opportunity with you, Shoshana, to share this important information. Everyone will be receiving a email shortly in your inbox with the next steps, how to get tested, emails, who to reach out to. So feel free to please take a look in your inboxes after the webinar and let us know if you have any additional questions. We are happy to share. We also have a SORD Facebook group that we'll share with you as well. If you type in just, I guess, SORD Deficiency in Facebook, it should pop up. And so just answer the questions in that, and you can be part of the Facebook group and connect with other patients and keep the conversation going. So thank you so much for.
Somebody had asked if I got vaccinated for COVID. I did. Before I got on a plane to go to Miami, I got vaccinated. Did I feel anything? Probably the same thing everybody else felt. My second vaccine, I got fever, chills, body aches, arm, a headache for like 2 weeks after. But yes, I got vaccinated.
Okay.
I definitely did.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Do we have any other last final thoughts, Shoshana, or comments?
Nope, just thank you to the HNF for organizing this webinar, and really big thanks to Priya for sharing her story, and to everyone who joined the webinar. I'm seeing the chat really blowing up with comments, and I'm really appreciative that everyone is joining in, and hopefully that momentum can continue, by connecting the community and also through research. So thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good night.